This show is a Hopful Media podcast production.
In his final days, Alexander the Great's generals asked him who should succeed him. Alexander's answer, the strongest. Taken literally, this would see the close of the classical Greek age, an age thousands of years in the making. Join me, Mark Selleck, as I go back to retell the story of ancient Greece in my series Casting Through Ancient Greece. We will cast our way back to its beginnings, all the way through to the spread of its culture throughout the known world, thanks to Alexander and his generals. You can listen and subscribe to the series at www.castingthroughancientgreece.com, or you can listen on your favourite podcasting platform. Don't forget to follow the series over on Twitter at Casting Greece or on Facebook at Casting Through Ancient Greece. I look forward to seeing you there.
Hello and bonjour. My name is Josh Zucker, and I want to take you on a journey through some of the most exciting events of the late Middle Ages. Valois-Burgundy was one of the medieval world's greatest what-ifs. Its dukes inherited, conquered, and politicked their way into forging a state between the German Empire and the Kingdom of France that rivaled them both. From the 100 Years' War to the Holy Roman Empire, from urban workers to Joan of Arc, and from gallant knights to gunpowder weapons, the Grand Dukes of the West had a part to play in almost all of Western Europe's biggest developments in the 14th and 15th centuries. If you want to learn more about the glamorous rise and dramatic fall of the Dukes of Burgundy, please join me for Grand Dukes of the West, A History of Valois-Burgundy.
One.
Contact.
I wonder if it picked that up.
Public television deep cuts only here on what show is this again?
America's Secret Wars. Speaking of, hello everybody. This is a podcast called America's Secret Wars. It is all about the forgotten, overlooked, and deliberately covered up times the United States has used military force to fight and occupy foreign soil. I am your host, Trevor Cully, still fueled by coffee, but this time a coffee stout. And this is part 2 of our episode on the 19th century American intervention in the Falkland Islands. You should probably listen to part 1, but I guess it's not strictly necessary to follow along today. I am also joined once again by Ben Jacobs of Wittenberg to Westphalia and Why Tho. Ben, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right, and I'm fueled by the United Theater's Blonde Ale.
Ooh, nice.
Yeah, it's a local thing. I don't know where the United Theater is. I think I looked it up at one point. But it's in Westerly. Yeah, it's down in Westerly, Rhode Island.
I knew that because I went to URI.
Yeah.
Anyway, this is College Talk with Trevor and Ben. This is also the first time I've actually done part 2 on purpose, and I have my set intro stuff for when I bring someone on for the first time, but we don't really need to go through the whole what do you remember from history class bit again, so I don't know. Have you seen anything good on TV?
We're between we just finished a rewatch of Babylon 5, and we're about to start Crusade. So, no.
There is a certain charm to Babylon 5.
Yeah. I love Babylon 5's first 4 seasons, and the 5th season is just a very painful slog. And now we're about to attempt the failed spin-off. So, good times.
Good luck. I have never attempted Crusade myself, so...
I should say that I sort of backed into Babylon 5 through Crusade. Like they were showing episodes of Crusade on the Sci-Fi channel, and not Babylon 5. And so I was just like, what's this cool show with techno mages and space stuff? But I only ever saw like one or two episodes because there weren't that many of them. So then I figured out that it was part of Babylon 5 and found a way to watch that and blah, blah, blah.
That is how the Sci-Fi channel gets you.
Yes.
I started watching, what was it, Eureka on their, like, 4th soft reboot in that show.
Yeah.
Great cast. They show up everywhere because it's a, like, 40-person ensemble, but some seasons are better than others. Anyway, you know what would make a real shit premise for TV?
The U.S. invasion of the Falkland Islands?
Yeah, the raid of the USS Lexington in 1831.
All right.
So last time we talked about the history of the Falkland Islands, which weirdly intersected with a lot of America's lesser-known wars, like the Quasi-War with France, the War of 1812, and a surprising amount of Irish rebellions.
I particularly enjoyed those.
Why did that happen? How did they all end up in Argentina? I get the Spanish Americas. You're fleeing Protestant oppression. Why Argentina?
Because it was kind of a lawless no man's land.
Okay, fair. If they wanted that, they could have just gone to northwestern Ireland.
Well, they wouldn't have been pursued by the British quite so strongly, and it was already on the shipping routes.
Also, they got potatoes.
Yeah, there you go.
So we left off with the Falklands nominally in the hands of the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata, a short-lived republic in parts of southern South America. But realistically, they were controlled by a German businessman named Louis Vernet, who had just seized 2 American sealing ships on the grounds that they were not paying their licensing fees, which they argued was because he had no right to charge them licensing fees.
Both sides had some good points.
Did they, though? The Americans certainly didn't have any particular right to be in the Falklands.
Yeah, but this guy also wasn't the government. I mean, I guess he was. I don't know.
He sort of was.
He had, if I recall correctly, he had been acknowledged as with the right to rule by both the United Provinces and the United Kingdom.
Yeah, that's just about as good as you get, considering those are the 2 countries that claimed the islands.
Yeah. So...
But as luck would have it, a 3rd ship managed to escape from this attack and got back to Philadelphia, where they informed President Andrew Trail of Motherfucking Tears Jackson, who swore to increase the U.S. naval presence in the South Atlantic.
So he sent one of the 6 ships there.
You know, we'd come a long way in a short time.
Okay.
Having a war against France and then a war against Britain really kickstarts your naval production in the early 1800s.
So, 15, 20?
We were up to, what is it at this point? 5 or 6 whole squadrons?
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
It wasn't a modern navy, but it wasn't just the Coast Guard that we once sent to invade Tunisia.
Okay, so
things that happen.
We're getting somewhere then. Yeah.
Yeah, we're becoming a military.
Okay.
So now that the U.S. government is actually getting directly involved in the Falklands instead of just Americans tripping over their own asses and getting stuck there, I should probably backtrack a little bit and explain some of the situation up in North America. So in 1585, the British settled their first colony in the Americas.
Yes, right.
No, we probably don't need to go quite that far back today.
Well, but you have to understand that the English were in the middle of a religious conflict over, et cetera, et cetera.
You could take that and slot it into any date in about 500 years of history in an applicable sentence. Now, what we should do is is run through the first 40 or so years of the American Revolution, or after the American Revolution, to explain a bit of how we ended up in this situation.
Yeah, that was me. I'm sure you're wondering how I got here.
Yeah, that is a lot of this podcast. One of the United States' primary goals post-independence was to expand colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. This was the first primary flashpoint for conflict in the first 2 episodes of this show when we talked about the Oconee War. And if you have listened to those episodes, you might remember that the European colonial empires on our borders immediately started backing indigenous nations as proxies. That was also right around the time that George Washington was begging his countrymen not to get involved in European wars or divide into political parties. So naturally, the very first thing that happened after he left office was a brutal partisan divide and an undeclared war with France.
Like you do.
Just never follow the advice you're given. Rules to live by. But this is all fine. We smoothed that out and gave First Consul Napoleon Bonaparte a lump sum of cash in exchange for the Louisiana Territory in 1803, doubling the size of the United States overnight, and heightening the partisan debates in the federal government, because we are so good at being a country.
Yeah, that's fair.
Skip forward a little further, it's 1812, we are totally not involved in European affairs, and our tensions with Britain hit a boiling point. Rapid American expansion scared the hell out of Spain and Britain. There were disputed borders on every side, and we were economically supporting Napoleon, which led to British embargoes and kidnapping American sailors to join the Royal Navy. So we declared war, mostly after all of those problems had been resolved.
Yeah, we just really wanted Canada.
We really did. I'm going to have to do like a long series on just all of the invasions of Canada, because they went on for a shockingly long amount of time.
Yeah.
Like, until World War II, one of Canada's primary defense objectives was what to do if the Americans invade.
Yeah. My favorite was the Fenian invasion, but
yes.
Anyway.
We will talk about that another time. In keeping with the theme of these episodes, Irish rebels moved to the United States, and we used them to invade Canada. They keep coming back.
Yep.
Spain got involved on the British side, and it mostly ended in a stalemate. The US wanted to annex Canada, but didn't. The British burned down a ton of Washington, D.C., and the only real outcome was demilitarizing the Great Lakes and catapulting a general called Andrew Jackson into the national spotlight for a victory after the war technically had already ended.
It was really important, though, for reasons.
It was impressive, and possibly the least racist thing Andrew Jackson ever did.
It's true.
He integrated his troops, he hired French pirates, it was one of the most interesting armies ever fielded by the United States.
That's definitely true.
Coming soon to a podcast near you. Everything that intersects with the other podcasts. Andrew Jackson went on to invade Florida, paving the way for the U.S. to annex a swampy hellscape that still plagues us to this day. And thanks to their opposition to the War of 1812, the Federalist Party collapsed entirely. So everyone rallied around Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party in the election of 1816, and the next 8 years were called the Era of Good Feelings, a period of one-party rule that gets praised for not verging on a civil war.
It was a nice change.
Yeah, because we're really good at being a country.
It's true.
So the president of these good feelings was James Monroe, who somewhat unfairly took the blame for an economic downturn in 1819, a thing that just kind of happens every now and then, especially after a war. And on top of our own wars, we'd also sorta been running a war profiteering enterprise from Europe for most of the preceding decade.
And that war was now over.
Yeah. But he also worked on the Missouri Compromise, the policy for what regions could enter the Union as slave states going forward, just kind of kicking that particular conflict further down the road to keep all those good feelings going if you were white. But it also meant that Missouri entered the Union, a sure sign that U.S. settlers were continuing to expand. More importantly, Monroe was the president overseeing American relations with the ongoing revolutions in South America, recognizing newly emerged countries and establishing a baseline for foreign policy. That baseline was the Monroe Doctrine, and it has been a cornerstone of our foreign policy for the last 200 years.
Even if Britain helped us make it happen.
That is an important part of this episode. Kind of the most important part. So for anybody who doesn't know, the Monroe Doctrine was introduced by James Monroe in his 1823 State of the Union, but ironically, the official policy document was actually written by the Secretary of State, later President John Quincy Adams. He summarized the new policy as, quote, "The occasion has been judged proper for asserting, as a principle in which the rights and interest of the United States are involved, that the American continents, by the free and independent condition which they have assumed and maintain, are henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers." That was, in fact, all one sentence.
That's how they did things back then.
They hadn't invented commas yet.
No. Well, no, they did, but they just loved them.
Fair.
They never met a comma that they didn't like.
If you just stick a dot above it, it's a semicolon, and then the whole thing flows better. Anyway, the only European power on board with this plan was also the only one that mattered, which was, as we said, the British. Despite their recent war, both the United States and Mother Britannia had a common interest. Because while they were having a pissing contest over the Canadian border, the entirety of the Spanish New World joined America and Haiti as independent states. Unlike the US, Britain had the naval power to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, and since they couldn't even reconquer us in 1812, never mind attempt to take over most of the hemisphere, they decided to just become the primary trade partner of all these new countries, which had been monopolized by Spain and Portugal for 300 years. Unsurprisingly, most of the other European powers didn't love this idea, but it was the British Navy, so what were they gonna do?
The only navies that had any chance of standing up to them had been crushed at Trafalgar, so nothing. There was nothing they could do.
This was a good time to be on friendly terms with the Royal Navy. Initially, most of the Hispanic revolutionaries felt pretty good about all this. It was like having a really experienced person at work take you under their wing while their old boss offered you money and guns.
That's definitely a situation that I'm familiar with from my work.
Yes, obviously. Who hasn't had that experience? I'm sure none of them will live to regret this in 10 to 20 minutes of podcasting.
Yes.
The United States did at least sort of attempt to put money where their mouth was. Because, like I mentioned earlier, the era of good feelings was the era of the American naval squadrons. Of course, we had a navy during the Revolution, but we disbanded it, only to commission a new emergency navy in 1794 when we realized we didn't have British protection anymore and had to fight future friends of the show, the Barbary Pirates.
Yay!
This new navy expanded during the War of 1812, like I said, because, war against the British Navy, big deal. Because of those Barbary pirates I just mentioned, and the realization that successful trade with Europe meant having a way to protect American merchants abroad, the U.S. had maintained a permanent squadron in the Mediterranean since 1801. Between that and the military buildup after the war, they suddenly had a lot of ships, and they could use those to support the new Hispanic republics and enter into a colonial race with Russia, Britain, and Spain to claim the Pacific Northwest. This led to 5 new permanent squadrons focused on enforcing our foreign policy: the African, Pacific, New Orleans, West Indies, and Brazilian squadrons.
And all those South American republics still going, yeah, great, American protection. Why are they so close?
Yeah, I mean, we just declared that we would protect them from foreign invasion, so we sent a bunch of boats with cannons. Nothing could go wrong.
Gotta be there to protect them.
Uh-huh. These squadrons were first and foremost charged with protecting American commerce. So less protection for them, but still protection.
Yeah, it's good. It's all good.
And that is commerce, much like the commerce that the audience can engage in with our sponsors, which I do enforce at the muzzle of a 42-pound mounted artillery piece. Hello, everybody. This is Trevor Cully, host of the History of Persia podcast. From about 550 to 330 BC, most of the Middle East was ruled by the Achaemenid Persians. The Achaemenids pioneered the concept of a truly multinational empire, which incorporated people from as far away as India and Greece for over 200 years. The story of Persia discusses the fall of ancient civilizations, the origins of endurance racing, 300 Spartans, the March of the 10,000, and at least one evil priest who replaced and impersonated the king. All before falling with the dramatic close at Alexander the Great's conquests. If that story, and the story of the cultures that surround it, sound interesting to you, check out The History of Persia at HistoryofPersiaPodcast.com, or wherever you find your favorite podcasts. We are back. Unfortunately, my entire merchant marine has been seized by pirates and taken to a mysterious land known as Libgen. I will be deploying the full force of Hopful Media's Torrent Squadron in response.
That's what you get for only having one 42-pound gun on your ships.
A fun thing about that, come back in 2 episodes. There's a good story.
Is it the guy who blew himself up?
No. It's the time we invaded Japan during the Civil War.
Okay, cool.
We hijacked a Chinese shipping barge and put a parrot gun on it.
Okay, cool.
Anyway, speaking of a response, back to the American response to Louis Vernet seizing a bunch of seal hunting ships in the Falkland Islands.
I'm sure we had a very well-reasoned and meaningful diplomatic discussion about this.
Funny thing about that.
No?
We will attack before there's time for diplomacy.
Okay, cool. Cool.
The new squadron served to spread the United States' first burst of nationalistic fervor. This surge came after the War of 1812, which was framed as a second revolution, and combined with the annexation of Florida and the still largely unconquered land of the Louisiana Purchase, it planted the seeds of America's manifest destiny. Though that phrase was only coined decades later, the basic idea is that America was uniquely morally superior and had a divine duty to spread its form of democratic republic across the world by the right of God. This was a thing people believed in the 1800s. This is not an exaggeration.
Then eagles flew overhead and everyone saluted.
Yeah, there's a reason all those paintings look like that.
Yeah.
I think even though he wrote decades before the term itself was used, Thomas Jefferson summarized it best when describing the goal of the American Revolution as a, quote, empire of liberty, or as Andrew Trail of Motherfucking Tears Jackson puts it, extending the area of freedom.
At the point of a gun.
By the will of God. Deus Vult.
Okay.
The Monroe Doctrine was essentially putting this into policy. Speaking of Jackson, despite more or less successfully navigating or most of the post-war political crises in the United States, James Monroe lost his grip on the era of good feelings by the end of his term, and this brief moment of one-party rule shattered in the election of 1824. This led to a slim Democratic-Republican victory with John Quincy Adams, but he was a consummate centrist, which is probably why he was able to win in the first place. The election of 24 almost sparked a civil war, and Congress was racked by partisan gamesmanship. You can insert the century of your choosing. The issue of slavery and territorial expansion was constantly at the fore, and Adams continuously grated on the South while somehow managing to not get any support for the North.
He was just that kind of guy. It was that kind of family.
Yeah, fortunately no other president running for re-election in 24 will ever have that problem.
Yeah.
In foreign affairs, he almost restarted the war with Britain and got the U.S. banned from trading with their Caribbean colonies for a bit. And he took a hands-off relationship to Latin America, which pissed off the South because he let those countries recognize Haiti, a country founded on a slave revolt that scared the shit out of the United States slaver aristocracy.
Yeah.
But, John Quincy Adams should have threatened Bolivia with war over recognizing Haiti? I don't know. Nobody wanted him to be there. They were just looking for excuses.
His post-presidency is my favorite part about John Quincy Adams, but just continually poking people in the eye about slavery from the House of Representatives.
That is like most of the middle 19th century is some version of that. And in 1828, the voters pushed General Andrew Trail of Motherfucking Tears Jackson, conqueror of Florida, and possibly the most violently racist man in a long series of violent racist men to ever hold the office, into the presidency.
He wasn't only violently racist, he also killed white people, too.
He discriminated by context. So if you couldn't tell, Andy Jax will be a recurring bastard on this show for a number of reasons. But in foreign affairs, he officially recognized the Republic of Texas, which seceded from Mexico after being taken over by a bunch of settlers from the United States. He also boosted funding to the Navy so that they could carry out armed retribution against anybody who threatened American capital. And that was the context in 1831 when Louis Vernet, the ambitious and greedy but duly appointed governor of the Falkland Islands, seized those ships on behalf of Buenos Aires, which was sort of its own city-state at this point as the United Provinces collapsed into civil war.
Luckily, he certainly had the support of Britain, too.
Yes, definitely. There will be lots of help here.
Yes.
He hopes. In May of 1831, Master Commandant Silas Duncan, a veteran of the War of 1812, took command of the USS Lexington, a 691-ton sloop of war, freshly retrofitted after spending a few years in the Mediterranean Squadron. Silas, the Lexington, and their crew were being redeployed to the Brazil Squadron in the South Atlantic to broadly reinforce the U.S. presence there as the United Provinces collapsed.
Sure. Might cause some instability that might cause some ships to be seized. You gotta reinforce the squadron.
Uh-huh. So while Silas went south, Louis Vernet had taken one of the captured American sealing ships, the Harriet, and its crew to Buenos Aires for a trial. He enlisted his other captives on board the Superior as convict labor, allowing them to go out seal hunting again, with all profits going straight to Louis while awaiting judgment.
What's a little seal hunting serfdom between friends?
Like we said in the last episode, the Falklands were sort of Louis Vernet's own private prison island.
Because really there was no other way to get people out there.
No, you had to take them by force. You can be in a jail in a city that will probably be under siege sometime the next 12 months, or you can go hunt cows.
All right.
Yeah.
Cows, you say? They're not dangerous, are they? I mean, if I'll have a gun, they don't move real fast.
You sound like me intimidating our mutual friend Ketho over what's going on in a game of D&D. Yes, unfortunately you rolled a 1. That cow was a bull, and you have been gored.
I'm just imagining the hunting sequences on an Oregon Trail and the buffalo just very slowly walk across the screen. And you're like, oh, that's a huge target.
That's pretty true to life. One of the episodes that I just have a document with a title for is our war against the buffalo, because we did deploy the army for that.
Yes. And we were much more successful than the Australian war against the emu.
The buffalo really should have been bipedal.
Yeah. They deserved it, really. It was their mistake.
Well, you've died of dysentery. Speaking of people who were probably dying of dysentery, we go back to the U.S. Navy in 1831, and this is where the timeline gets all sorts of fucked up. There's no other way to explain this. Louis seized the American sealing ships, fun to say that, in August. But the Lexington set out in May.
Okay.
And was at sea for months before reaching its new posting in Brazil. So they did not know that this had happened yet.
Okay.
Meanwhile, the escaped ship had to make the trip all the way from the Falklands to Philadelphia.
Okay.
Ironically, this meant that the U.S. consulate in Buenos Aires, Silas Duncan on the Lexington, and the United States public all found out about this stuff at roughly the same time in November and early December.
Okay. Oh, man. Yeah, okay. Time and space are weird in the old times.
Yeah, bear in mind, the Lexington was not in Buenos Aires. That's just when the rumor mill reached them in Brazil. Coincidentally, the Harriet reached Buenos Aires in November, and the ship's captain went directly to the U.S. consulate to accuse Louis Vernet of piracy. The American consul immediately lodged a protest against the Buenos Aires Foreign Ministry, but thanks to that one ship that escaped, this was more of a formality. The consul denounced Louis as a pirate and warned that he was laying the foundation for the Falklands to become, quote, another Cuba, meaning a pirate haven in this case, not communist.
Okay.
And this was hyperbolic based on the information they had, but I don't necessarily think he was wrong. Louis had a pretty clear track record of doing business with whoever would help him get ahead. If that happened to be pirates in the future, I doubt he would have had a problem with it.
Yeah, that seems in character.
He was also arguably a pirate.
Yeah.
He mixed his personal finances with his official governor position, and the government of Port Louis effectively served as his own private town.
I mean, it's a company town.
Yeah.
It doesn't make you a pirate.
When you start seizing ships on the basis of you own the town, like, I'm not sure where the line is there.
Fair.
It was also a penal colony, so it may have had a couple pirates already.
Sure.
The British consul in Buenos Aires even agreed with all this and sent a letter back to his own head office in London just a few weeks later. Keep that in the back of your head.
Yes.
On December 9th, the USS Lexington reached Buenos Aires, and Silas Duncan was given the latest updates, including the declaration that Vernet was a pirate. So, this is going to come up a lot, especially in a few upcoming episodes, but the overseas U.S. Navy squadrons in the 19th century had a lot of leeway in what they could do on their own because communication was so slow.
Sure.
So 19 days later, Silas was anchored off the coast of East Falkland.
Filthy pirates.
To quote Amuse, Louis really was the worst pirate I've ever heard of. There is no direct evidence for it, but according to accounts that circulated in Argentina afterwards, Commandant Silas ordered his crew to strike down the American flag and raise a French tricolor instead, so as not to alert the settlers.
And by settlers, we mean the prisoners.
Yeah, the prisoners, the gauchos, Vernet's other cronies, the motley crew on board the Falkland Islands.
Yeah.
And the thing is, this is possible. It's also possible that it's a lie and propaganda, or it's possible that people thought they saw the American flag or saw the French flag, and it was just the Stars and Stripes, because that seems to happen a lot in this period.
Yeah, I mean, the colors are the same, and, you know.
Yeah, people were still getting used to the red, white, and blue tricolor, and it happens in a lot of different places that I found, where people get that mixed up with the U.S.
The other thing is that, like, I've heard a couple stories from this period about ships flying false flags, and it's like one of these, when it works, the British Navy declares them a hero, and the other side is like shaking their fists and they're super angry, and the British Navy is like, well, we won. Yeah,
like, who knows?
Yeah.
There's no evidence that's not like second or third hand, but that doesn't mean a whole lot at this point, given the literacy rate in the Falklands.
Sure, yeah.
So they hung around off the coast of Berkeley Sound for a few days, waiting for better sailing conditions to come into port, and then they just happened to run into another American sealer. This was the Eagle, and Silas Duncan met with that ship's crew to requisition their ship for temporary military service. tying it behind the Lexington on a tow cable as they sailed into Port Louis on New Year's Eve, 1831.
What was the sealing ship going to do? Did they have guns?
I think just another vessel to maneuver was the plan.
Okay.
Louis Vernet and his colonists were about to have a very unhappy New Year. Because when a great big warship pulled into their little town with all its gun ports open and ready to go, now flying no flag at all, a significant chunk of the 100 or so people living in Port Louis fled into the countryside, mostly black slaves and gauchos.
I mean, that's probably the smart move. Yeah.
Absolutely the best choice.
The, whatever forts were there were, like, dilapidated and crumbling, right? Like,
No, Vernet has had a few years at this point to build them back up, so they have
okay.
at least stockades
Okay.
on stone foundations and things like that, but it's not impressive by any stretch.
Sure. Granted, a sloop of war isn't exactly a ship of the line either.
You know, when it's that versus some tree trunks?
Yeah, they're probably fine. Guy probably knows what he's doing.
To give perspective on the scale here, Silas ordered 17 Marines to get their guns and take the Eagle to shore as a landing party.
Okay, yeah.
But also, like, the total population of the island is 100.
Yeah.
So you don't need a ton of soldiers.
It was probably an equal match or something for the armed militia or whatever.
Yeah, well, I mean, a significant chunk of the population is gauchos who were just all armed.
Yeah, okay.
But U.S. Marines were significantly better armed.
Yes.
They reached the island and met with Matthew Brisbane, the British naval officer turned into the director of fisheries, and with Henry Metcalfe, another Brit acting as temporary governor in Louis's absence.
Okay.
Because it's super not a British colony. When negotiations with the Marines took too long, Silas Duncan sent 2 rowboats from the Lexington with more Marines to get his point across. After being politely invited to come aboard the American ship by 30 heavily armed men, the British Argentine Falklander officials accepted the offer, and an American lieutenant described their arrival in his diary. Once they had stepped on the deck of the ship, they were subjected to offensive treatment. Duncan, facing Brisbane, called him pirate and thief deserving to be hanged. From that moment on, Metcalfe and Brisbane could be regarded as prisoners, to whom no insult or injury would be spared.
I love that this is the director of fisheries. I work I work in the same building as the Department of Environmental Management in Rhode Island, and we share a cafeteria. And it's just like I'm trying to imagine the British equivalent of one of those pleasant hippies.
Well, picture one of them as also a veteran of Trafalgar.
Oh dear. Okay. Yes.
And that gives you a better sense of Matthew Brisbane.
Okay. So this is probably a poor choice.
I mean, he is significantly outnumbered.
Right.
And bound.
Yeah.
Though he will come back up.
Sure.
Most of the Marines stayed on land, and they proceeded to give Port Louis the full pirate haven makeover. That meant capturing any men still in town, which were mostly German emigrants to Argentina. A thing that never changes.
Yeah.
It also meant destroying every gun they found, breaking all of the port's cannons, and blowing up their powder reserves.
So all future seal hunting is going to be javelin-based, I suppose.
Well, all further seal hunting will have to come from the United States, and wouldn't that just be great?
Yeah, sure, yeah, okay.
Once Silas had the colony's leaders in captivity, he took even more Marines ashore himself to occupy the town and arrest any remaining residents. The colonists' accounts and Silas's own tell very different stories. According to the official American record, most of the prisoners were released as soon as they identified the men who actually physically participated in seizing their ships, and the only people who did any looting were the now liberated American sealers who had been taken captive.
Mm-hmm.
The Argentine version paints this as a violent sack of the town, where the Americans took everything that wasn't nailed down, people included.
I'm gonna say that doesn't sound. That sounds about right.
The British accounts mostly agree with the Americans on this one,
Okay.
and one of the people reporting to the British in this case was Matthew Brisbane.
Okay.
So they had every reason to lie.
Yeah. Okay. So the Americans were mostly well behaved. Although I have to think, like, wouldn't most of the people who seized the ships be in Buenos Aires with the governor guy?
A significant portion of them, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
They went house to house of the people who were still in town, figured out if they were actually mad at anybody.
He's not here, man.
But because of what happened next, the Argentinian official version is different.
Sure.
So with this colony now in shambles, and most of its government either in Buenos Aires or in the Lexington's brig, Silas Duncan offered most of the colonists the option to come back to the mainland, and many of them agreed.
Yeah, that's a good call.
They sold off their livestock to the few people who decided to stick around, and the crew of the Lexington helped repair another American ship so that they could expand their carrying capacity.
Mm-hmm.
They're now up to like 3 sealing ships and a sloop of war, just to make sure they can fit all the people who want to leave.
Okay, yeah. Again, continuing the theme of the Falklands being just like a great place that people definitely want to live on.
Yeah, super appealing, everybody. It's like one of those towns in Canada that occasionally offers like a $60,000 salary just to come live there.
Yeah.
Then on January 4th, 5 days after Silas captured the port and arrested its leadership as pirates, a letter from the War Department in Washington, D.C. reached the Brazilian squadron in Rio de Janeiro, ordering them to investigate these accusations of piracy and take appropriate reprisal.
Was he even control? Like, I know, like, the squadron had a lot of leeway, but theoretically, like, shouldn't the commander of the squadron have been doing this? Not just like.
As I follow the timeline, Duncan would have reached Rio shortly before news of the Falkland incident got there. So he would have been there when the Commodore found out.
Okay. So he was sent. He wasn't just like. It's just weird that they'd be like, you just got here.
Yeah, this isn't some random commandant just going off on his own. He does at least have some of his superiors.
Okay.
Just maybe not the superiors you'd want to attack a foreign nation.
Sure, yeah, okay.
Over the next 3 weeks, quite a lot happened, but most of it can be boiled down to Silas Duncan occupied and governed Port Louis under martial law.
Okay.
Handling government stuff like rescuing a French shipwreck, granting permission to new sealing ships, coincidentally, mostly Americans.
Uh-huh.
And reassuring the colonists that had fled into the countryside that he was not a pirate. Except for, seizing territory from a foreign government without any declaration of war and confiscating all their goods with his warship, which is only piracy if you fly the wrong flag.
I'm not a pirate. I'm conducting an aggressive military campaign. Totally different.
with no authorization from my central government, and stealing a bunch of your stuff.
So I'm a privateer. I'm privateering right now.
On the side. Up in Buenos Aires, the government sided with Louis and said that he was in the right for stopping the American incursion in Argentine waters. In response to that, Silas Duncan unilaterally declared the Falklands unowned by anybody, and that Louis would be hung as a pirate.
This guy's, he's just going for it.
Roughly 30% of this entire podcast is going to be based on stories of some middling naval officer just declaring countries to exist or not.
Yeah, okay. I mean, that's how the British Empire happened.
Yeah, uh-huh. We learned it from you, Dad.
So, Di was watching a YouTube video the other day of British teens trying American sodas for the first time, and they kept going on and on about how all American stuff is so sweet. And I just turned around and went, "We learned it from you!"
I was about to say, they're the only country I've ever been to where they advertise how milky their milk chocolate is.
It's true, yeah. Also, the sodas they were trying in the videos were ridiculous. They weren't like normal sodas.
Okay. They were silly ones, like.
Yeah, it was like sour. Oh, what are those? The sour candies. It's like a sour candy branded soda.
Oh,
it's like
Sour Patch Kids.
Yeah, like Sour Patch Kids soda.
Oh God,
things like that. No one actually drinks.
Yeah.
Anyway,
novelty gift sodas. Well, actually, this is great timing for that story, because you know what would taste great on a warm Argentinian day in January? The sweet taste of cinnamon Coke, free of any distracting raspberry overtones.
Go on. I'm intrigued.
It is wholly unlike the lesser Coca-Cola products still being pushed by those monsters in Atlanta.
What can we do to ensure that this wonder comes back?
You should tell Coca-Cola that they're wrong on the social media of your choice and listen to whatever sponsors come after this musical break.
Sounds great.
Africa is a land with endless stories to tell. From epic battles, brilliant rulers, and the dramatic rise and fall of civilizations, join us on the History of Africa podcast to learn the oft-ignored stories of the African continent. From the sands of Cairo to the plains of Zimbabwe, and from the mountains of Ethiopia to the forests of the Congo, find the History of Africa podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
All right. Okay. We'll go back to podcasting now.
Yep.
So, after declaring Louis Vernet a fugitive from his own colony, the Lexington and a small cadre of confiscated Argentine sailing ships set sail on January 22nd, leaving only 38 people on the Falklands year-round. The other 72 plus decided to go back, not to Argentina, just to the mainland, because the Americans took them to Uruguay.
I mean, oh God. You know, it's not like they were at war or anything.
Well, I think they probably opted to go to Uruguay. I think this was informed.
Yeah. Yeah, if they'd gone to Argentina, they may have been sent back.
Right, a lot of them were prisoners and slaves. They decided to get the hell out.
I feel like there's some conversation there where the slaves all get together and went to the captain, you should definitely take us to Uruguay. Like, Uruguay? I thought you were from Argentina. Oh, it's all the same, really.
Yeah, really anywhere that's not where we're from.
Well, that doesn't make sense to me, but I suppose you people know your business. To Uruguay.
Also in Uruguay, the prisoners, the government officials of the Falklands colony, were put in chains by Silas and jailed in Montevideo.
Sure, because they were agents of a government that...
They were pirates. Yeah.
They were pirates.
At this point, things mostly shifted from military to civilian affairs. The dispute over whether Louis had any right to enforce his sealing license or was engaged in piracy went to the courts. But there was a problem. Remember Matthew Brisbane?
He was... Yeah. Okay.
Well, he was British, and this pissed off the British consulate in Buenos Aires.
Sure.
Which was a problem for the Americans in their court case.
Sure. Wait, which court system was this in?
The Argentinian Buenos Aires, whatever country you want to call them at the time, courts.
Okay.
See, Louis Vernet and the Argentine government saw these Americans show up with a bunch of their people in chains and accusing them of piracy, which was a capital offense, and basically said, bro, what the fuck is this? This was in their courts. So if that's their reaction, you need a good argument.
Right.
The American legal defense hinged on British support. So they quickly released Matthew Brisbane to smooth things over with the Brits, and they argued in Buenos Aires that Louis had no right to occupy the islands because they were actually British territory all along.
Sure, yeah, except that he was operating for both Britain and Argentina.
No, British territory all along. That's why they gave him his assent, because it was for Britain.
Right.
Or something. The argument hinged entirely on the British claiming that they had a secret agreement with Spain. Remember that at the beginning of the last episode?
Yes.
So they claimed that way, way back in 1771, which is awfully convenient considering it was before 2/3 of the countries involved even existed.
Go on.
That would have been a few years after Spain kicked out the French and the British settlers in part 1 of this episode, and there actually is a hint of evidence in letters between Spanish and French mediators that this agreement sort of existed.
Okay.
The text from the French diplomat involved says that the British could reoccupy their settlement for a, quote, decent interval.
Okay. That's vague.
Hyper-specific terminology.
Yeah.
But if that's not the text of the actual agreement, it's just like what the French guy vaguely knew about.
Right.
But that's all we really have to go on. And the thing is, this reoccupation never happened. The American Revolution sucked Spain in as an anti-British ally, and that really disrupted Britain's ability to get that close to South America for a few years afterwards.
Right. Plus, there was that very important contribution of the British garrison of the Falklands being sent to North America.
Yes.
That we talked about
they
last
put
time.
down the rebels.
They did.
All by themselves. The American negotiators in Buenos Aires were now arguing that, as of 1832, Britain had never relinquished its claim and was ready to reassert it. Note, the Brits are not making this point.
Okay. Yeah. So the Americans are making these arguments, and the Brits on the other side of the room are going,
Hey, what?
No?
Leaning over to, the consul leaning over to his secretary. Did you know about this?
The Americans are just looking over them going, right, guys? Right? Come on, come on.
And all of this entire legal argument, was a blatant refutation by the United States of its own Monroe Doctrine.
That's right, yes.
Because they were arguing to take territory from a newly freed republic to give it to a European power.
Yes, that is what they were doing.
All of this was patently untrue. In 1790, Britain and Spain were fresh off fighting one another in our War of Independence, when they almost started a massive war over the Pacific Northwest.
Right.
The UK wanted to expand Canada further west, and the Spanish wanted to take Mexico all the way up to Vancouver.
Right. Yes. Quick plug here. If anyone has any interest in this, check out the Nations of Canada podcast. It's very good.
Ooh, that sounds good. Yeah,
Yeah,
I will be checking that out.
It's really good.
So the two sides of this conflict worked out a deal allowing Britain to take the Pacific Northwest in exchange for a few concessions, like their claim to the Falkland Islands.
Right.
And unlike the earlier agreement, this treaty was public knowledge.
Oh, God.
Needless to say, Buenos Aires didn't buy the American argument and said they would not only find Louis Vernet innocent of piracy, but they would send him back to the Falklands to resettle the islands.
Seems like him and those 38 other people are like the only people who want anything to do with these islands.
Yeah, I really think they're down to just the, 40-ish human beings who want to be there.
Most of whom aren't from Argentina.
Almost all of whom are from Germany. It is effectively a German colony. So at this point, there wasn't much the U.S. could do about it, short of reinvading, and this contributed to a breakdown in relations between Buenos Aires and the Jackson administration that eventually saw the U.S. consulate up and leave Argentina entirely for a couple of decades.
Oh, wow.
We just up and left and told them to sort it out on their own. One of the few times we've ever done that in the rest of the American hemisphere.
Yes.
If it was not clear from 60 years of negotiations, the British really did have an interest in the Falklands, which was part of why they made sure to support Louis Vernet having a bunch of Englishmen on his staff.
Right.
Their representatives in Buenos Aires had even been writing home with updates about opportunities to take over the islands since the revolutions against Spain began.
But the Americans did this in the one way calculated to turn the British against them.
Well, no. The American intervention lit some fire under the British. They realized they needed to take action if they wanted to actually take the islands before Argentina got there.
I mean, the Americans took over the place with a sloop.
Yeah. It was like a 16-gun ship. 30 Marines and 16 cannons, and they took over the Falkland Islands. And the crew of the sealing ship Eagle, which I assume was like 9 guys. But when I say the British acted soon, I mean the plan was already in motion by the time the court ruled in Louis's favor.
The only people more rapacious than the Americans are the British.
I mean, at this point, it's not even a competition.
Right, sure.
We are just, at this point, a decade or two off from the scramble for Africa.
Right, true, yeah.
So just after New Year's 1833, a British naval vessel arrived in the desolate husk of Port Louis and raised the Union Jack. Louis Verney and Matthew Brisbane were still in Buenos Aires at the time, but Louis, wanting to get a handle on the situation, sent the best person to negotiate with the British, the British naval officer Matthew Brisbane.
Okay.
By the time he arrived in March, there was not anything he could really do except stick around and go back to being British. He worked out an arrangement where he was the local representative for Louis Verney's company instead of a government official.
Sure, yeah. That works out. Yeah.
So everyone's still making their money. Louis just doesn't get to be a petty dictator.
That seems fair.
Yeah.
More or less.
It's the best case scenario, really, because let's be honest, these men would have died trying to run these islands without a larger foreign power coming in.
Yes. Yeah.
They just did not have the resources or the willpower on their own. Brisbane did get to enjoy something of a historical spectacle shortly after arriving. He turned up in Port Louis just a few days before the HMS Beagle.
Oh, okay.
Carrying Charles Darwin, who stopped by to study the island's native animals on his journey around the tip of South America.
That's cool. I'm sure he didn't appreciate it.
Well, for Charles Darwin, it wasn't the Galapagos, but the Falklands had been so isolated that they provided genuinely important data to the theory of evolution.
Oh, yeah, no, sure. I meant Brisbane. Probably was like, oh, here's a weird scientist going over there.
Well, he was still, somewhere between, celebrity scientist and, not yet denounced by the church.
Okay, cool.
Because he's still just a rich science guy instead of undermining the concept of creation.
Okay, yeah, sure.
So this was actually considered kind of an event on the island. Also the fact that anybody of any note whatsoever was on the island.
Yeah. You're interested in things other than shooting random wild cows? Wow.
Yeah.
What an eccentric gentleman.
Oh, you want to shoot the random wild birds instead and study their corpses.
That doesn't make sense to me, but I suppose you know your business.
Lucky for Charles Darwin, he had the good fortune to leave the Falklands before everything went south.
Oh no.
Because Brisbane kept trying to use the paper money that Louis Verney was printing in the old days to pay his household staff.
Oh no.
Except this was completely worthless.
Oh no. Ironically, when Darwin left before things went south, he went south.
True. And then north pretty immediately afterwards.
Yeah.
Fed up with this situation of being paid in almost literal monopoly money, the convict laborers Louis had sent to the island with the initial settlement and who stuck around grabbed some guns and started killing anyone trying to enforce Louis Verney-era laws.
Okay, sure.
Or anybody using his currency, before running off into the countryside to become bandits for the next 6 months.
I mean, they had a point.
Yeah, they were hunted down by British authorities, captured and deported back to Argentina because they had just gone on a random killing spree.
Yeah, probably the best outcome for them, though.
But killing Matthew Brisbane was the death blow to any hopes of Argentinian reoccupation of the island.
Sure.
And given that he was a British officer, I'm not sure why they had been holding out hope.
Sure.
But the fun fact is, the leader of those bandits was hailed as an Argentinian national hero for rebelling against British occupation.
Sure. Yeah. It was definitely nationalism and not the monopoly money
that was it.
made that happen.
I imagine he got back and was like, wait, you're cheering for... All right, I'm going to roll with it.
Yeah, we're going to go with that.
I did it for this country. Which country are we in today?
Viva us!
Viva Buenos Aires was probably a good bet because, like, the city was in some country at the time.
Sure, yes. Undoubtedly.
Losing the Falkland Islands was a massive blow to Louis Vernet personally. He had invested most of his personal fortune in the venture and wound up utterly broke, trying to find a way of returning to the Falklands as a businessman or regaining them for Argentina with support from every country he could find a connection to. They all turned him down.
Sure.
No country in the world wanted to give Louis Vernet to make a third attempt on the Falklands. Argentina was the only country that ever supported him, but nobody wanted to recognize Argentina's claim and start a spat with the British over some rocks at the far end of the world.
Yeah, you can't argue with that logic.
Yeah, and so over the decades, minor disputes and controversies broke out every 10, 20, 30 years or so as Argentina rattled sabers at the British, and the British rattled very large cannons back at them. And this came to a head in the Falkland War of 1982, which started almost 150 years to the day after Silas Duncan's raid was reported to the State Department.
Sure, okay, yeah.
Does that mean the Falklands War was the United States' fault? If indirectly, sort of. The UK really did want those islands at some point, but it was the raid of the Lexington that expedited the whole process. Like, if we hadn't acted when we did, there is a chance that Argentina would have been the one to take the islands more permanently.
Yeah, I mean, one guy sort of went off the chain and did a little raid, and 150 years later, there were consequences.
Yeah.
It's crazy how that happens.
It is one of those historical butterfly effects, for sure. And that is the American invasion of the Falkland Islands and our micro battle with whichever country they align themselves with at the time. Ben, do you have any thoughts?
I feel like this is a story that mitigates against thought.
Well, you just have to wait 4 to 6 months for the thoughts to reach the next mail post.
This is a classic story where when you have an area without central authority, really crazy things can happen. Yeah, I think that's the biggest takeaway. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, just some really wild characters going completely nuts over a bunch of rocks that have sheep.
Yeah.
And seals and not much else.
Yeah, this is a thing I talked about in, I think, the very first episode, is we're going to talk about some wars where the United States was objectively in the wrong and doing horrible things. We're going to talk about a couple where we might have been on the right side of history, at least a little bit. And we're going to talk about stuff like this where, I don't know.
Yeah.
It happened.
Yep.
There's not always lessons.
I mean, I guess the main lesson is don't get between the British and some seals.
Yeah, or, I mean, really, this is the earlier version of the reason we did the Panama Canal. Like,
right, yeah.
The British wanted these islands so they could control the passage to the Pacific.
Yeah, because I mean, I guess that's the thing we didn't really talk about last time, is that they're strategically located near, it's like one of the last habitable places before the Straits of Magellan. so it's strategically located. It's just physically worthless.
Yeah.
Because as bad as the Falklands are, the actual like Tierra del Fuego is even worse. So it's like at least you can have a base on the Falklands, more or less.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's just like they are one of two places you can stop, and this one has food. Like,
yeah.
For better or worse, the United States, and we will eventually do an episode on it, expedited that whole process 100 years later.
of getting the canal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Though we were talking before I started recording about William Walker, who tried to do that canal a lot earlier.
That's another wild guy.
Yeah, that he has. I can't even figure out if he's a bonus episode or a regular episode or where he fits into this show, but he'll be here.
He has a really bad movie made about him. The only good thing about it is that Joe Strummer did the soundtrack.
Oh, that will improve any movie.
Yeah.
But yes, that was the Falklands Raid, which somehow became the Falklands War.
150 years later. Very slow match.
Yeah, both the U.S. and Argentina and Britain all got distracted in there for a bit. Other things happened.
I mean, we could talk for 20 minutes about the actual causes of the Falklands War.
Yeah, it's nuts. And like 3 of them begin and end with Margaret Thatcher. But
yeah. An entrenched military dictatorship looking for a distraction for its people ran up against a right-wing democratically elected government trying to jangle keys in front of its people.
And fortunately, it never happened again. Tune in next time to America's Secret Wars. And on that note, Ben, do you want to tell people where they can find you on the internet?
Yes, my main show is Wittenberg to Westphalia, Wars of the Reformation, a show that's theoretically about the Wars of the Reformation in early modern Europe, but I'm on episode 97 of Background. It's the main websites, so the show is available on all podcatchers, whatever you're using, it's on there. The website's Wittenberg to Westphalia podcast at weebly.com. I'm on Twitter at W2W Podcast. I'm on Blue Sky, again, W2W Podcast on Facebook. I also have a show called Why Tho, a personal journey through my record collection, and I'm sure you can find that as well.
Very, very good. And for the record, the 2 in your Twitter handle is the number 2.
Oh, yes. Yeah. It's important to note.
Yep. And if you want more information about this show, you can go to secretwarspod.com. If you want to follow me online, go to @HistoryOfPersia, so I don't have to maintain too many social media accounts. And if you want to support this show, Patreon is still going to be around for at least another week. More information on that coming soon. But also, please, now that we are on Apple Podcasts, review on Apple Podcasts. You listen to these, you know that helps. Until next time, I don't know, read about the Falklands War, because I'm not going to cover it.
In his final days, Alexander the Great's generals asked him who should succeed him. Alexander's answer, the strongest. Taken literally, this would see the close of the classical Greek age, an age thousands of years in the making. Join me, Mark Selleck, as I go back to retell the story of ancient Greece in my series Casting Through Ancient Greece. We will cast our way back to its beginnings, all the way through to the spread of its culture throughout the known world, thanks to Alexander and his generals. You can listen and subscribe to the series at www.castingthroughancientgreece.com, or you can listen on your favourite podcasting platform. Don't forget to follow the series over on Twitter at Casting Greece or on Facebook at Casting Through Ancient Greece. I look forward to seeing you there.
Gamarjoba. My name is Roberto, And I would like to sincerely thank you for taking the time to check out my podcast, The History of Sakartvelo, Georgia. In all likelihood, I would venture to guess that you found us because you were searching for either podcasts, YouTube videos, blogs about the history of Georgia, or you're hearing this on another podcast, like this one. I'm both sorry and happy to report that this beautiful and fascinating country is, to my great surprise, criminally underrated in the history world. As of now, this is the only podcast I am aware of dedicated to the full history of a nation and a people that have served as the battleground for empires all throughout European and Asian history. But the land of the Kartveli is so much more than that. The birthplace of wine, the second Christian kingdom, the land of fantastic food, nearly superhuman dancers and musicians, and perhaps, most importantly, a people that have preserved their culture, pride, and independence after centuries of one conquest after another. Empires rise and fall, but Sakartvelo always seems to survive in the end. So, let us celebrate this beautiful land by coming with me on this journey from prehistory to the present day, right here at the History of Sakartvelo, Georgia. You can find us on Twitter at history_Georgia. Sakartvelo is spelled Sakartvelo. Now back to your regularly scheduled podcast.